It's terrible that after 50 years, it is behind closed doors.
2 minutes ago, a decision inside the royal household shattered years of careful silence. Princess Anne did not request permission, seek compromise, or wait for another private discussion. She reclaimed the Queen Mother's ruby tiara and made one condition brutally clear: Camilla would not be granted access. What looked like a dispute over royal jewels was, in truth, a far deeper judgment about trust, inheritance, and who had the right to touch the monarchy's most emotional symbols. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne entered the secured room with quiet resolve. The Queen Mother's ruby tiara was not a royal ornament. It was a personal heirloom, a jewel, carrying the memory of older royal women and the unspoken belief that access meant acceptance. When the velvet case opened, she pressed her lips together. The rubies caught the light, but the Princess Royal felt no excitement. She felt sadness. She believed the tiara had started being discussed too casually, as though history could be borrowed without consequence. Then came the decision. Anne reclaimed the Queen Mother's ruby tiara from royal custody, personally placed it under restricted family control, and formally denied Camilla access to it. Restricted family control meant the jewel could not be used because a senior royal requested it. Direct family approval would now be required. She signed the restriction before dawn. She had already studied an old family inventory, a private record listing inherited possessions and conditions attached to them, where a handwritten instruction beside the tiara had stopped her cold. Camilla did not move when the message reached her private sitting room. She stared at the aide, then asked her to repeat the wording. She needed to hear the humiliation again. Denied access. Not delayed. Not reconsidered. Denied. Her hand tightened against the chair, as she realized Anne had left no space for compromise. Charles received the notice only after the transfer was complete. The king read it once, set it down, then lifted it again. A royal custody notice, meaning a formal record controlling who could handle or use a family heirloom, now carried his sister's restriction. He said nothing. The monarch understood that Anne had moved before anyone could soften the language, delay the process, or rescue Camilla from the blow. And that silence opened the darkest question of all. Why had Anne become so certain that Camilla should never wear the ruby tiara? Because the real shock was not that Anne had taken the tiara back. It was that every person in that family understood exactly who she believed had crossed the line. To understand why a ruby tiara could divide a royal family, you have to forget the diamonds, the titles, and the palace protocol for a moment. This was personal. Princess Anne saw herself as a guardian of memories that could never defend themselves. Camilla saw the restriction as a public rejection hidden behind private paperwork. And King Charles found himself trapped between a wife demanding dignity and a sister who had finally decided that loyalty required resistance. Camilla gripped the back of a chair beside the writing desk and looked at Charles. "Did you know?" she asked. The queen consort stayed calm, but the question carried everything she feared. Access to the ruby tiara would have meant acceptance into an older royal tradition, where jewels carried family memory as much as status. To her, denial meant some doors remained closed. Charles hesitated. The king wanted to answer carefully, yet that pause wounded her before he spoke. He insisted he had not approved the final restriction, but Camilla barely heard the distinction. Her humiliation had become personal, because silence from her husband felt almost as sharp as rejection from his sister. Anne sat alone later, with the inventory file closed before her. A family inventory was a private record of inherited objects and conditions attached to them. But to the Princess Royal, it carried voices from people long gone. She remembered her grandmother, and the belief that inherited jewels were history placed temporarily in living hands. Anne felt no victory. Protecting an inheritance, she admitted, could make the protector look cruel. William had known more than Charles realized. During a private conversation earlier, Anne told the prince she was considering a restriction. He chose not to stop her. The future king said inherited symbols should never become tools for repairing personal relationships. Anne remembered those words because they confirmed her fear that the tiara was being forced to carry an emotional burden. Then Charles found the detail that changed everything. Camilla had previously made a direct request concerning the ruby tiara, asking that it be considered for ceremonial use tied to her position. Anne had not read that request as curiosity. She had read it as pressure for lasting access. The king stared at the wording and realized both women had attached different meanings to the same request. Soon, the family began looking backward. One private royal gathering kept returning to every conversation, because that was where Anne's concern had hardened into a decision. And when they traced the rupture to one particular evening, the tiara suddenly stopped looking like the cause of the conflict and became the evidence of it. The point of no return had come 6 weeks earlier at a private Windsor jewelry review, an event so routine that no one expected it to matter. There were no speeches and no raised voices at first. Then Camilla asked one question about the Queen Mother's ruby tiara. Anne heard the words, looked across the table, and understood the request very differently from everyone else in the room. From that moment, the future of the jewel was already being rewritten. Camilla asked that the tiara be reserved for her exclusive use at an upcoming Commonwealth reception. The reception was a formal gathering connected to nations of the Commonwealth, and ceremonial jewels were often chosen to carry a public message. Anne, Charles, and a senior jewelry custodian had been reviewing future pieces with her. Until that moment, every exchange had been careful, practical, and controlled. Anne slowly removed her glasses. "Exclusive use?" she asked. The Princess Royal looked directly at Camilla and wanted to know whether she understood whose history the tiara carried. Her question changed the room instantly. The Queen Consort felt challenged, and she answered that her present position should come with practical privileges. To her, the request meant recognition. To Anne, it sounded dangerously close to entitlement. Camilla held her ground. She insisted that she was not claiming ownership, only asking for a clear ceremonial arrangement. Anne's expression hardened, because the distinction did not comfort her. The jewel had belonged to an older generation, carried private memories, and remained emotionally tied to women who could no longer speak for themselves. That was why the words, exclusive use, mattered so deeply. Then the jewelry custodian opened an older inventory record. A family inventory was a private list tracking inherited possessions and any instructions connected to them. Beside the ruby tiara sat a handwritten note, direct family discretion. That phrase meant access remained subject to close family judgment rather than automatic use based on rank. Anne noticed it immediately. Camilla noticed her reaction just as quickly. Charles waited until the review ended before speaking privately with his sister. The king asked Anne not to turn a disagreement over jewelry into a family war. She closed the file and looked at him without anger. "The war begins when memory is treated as decoration," the Princess Royal said during that private conversation. He knew then that she had already crossed an emotional line from concern into action. Anne began preparing the restriction that same evening. Camilla later learned through a documented custody briefing that access was about to be blocked, and the Queen Consort refused to let the final decision happen without confronting her. So when the two women finally stood face to face, neither came to discuss a jewel. They came to defend their place in the royal family. There were no aides in the room when Camilla confronted Princess Anne. No private secretary. No courtier prepared to interrupt an uncomfortable silence. The Queen Consort entered, carrying the anger of someone who believed she had been judged without a hearing. Anne remained beside a table, one hand resting near the closed inventory file. For several seconds, neither woman sat down. Then Camilla asked the question the entire palace had been avoiding. "Who gave you the right?" Camilla had demanded the private meeting the moment she learned Anne had prepared the access restriction. The Queen Consort wanted answers before the tiara was moved, but the Princess Royal refused to delay the transfer. A restriction meant control over who could use the heirloom, and once entered into the family custody record, it carried weight. That mattered, because the jewel represented acceptance as much as ceremony. Anne kept the room empty by choice. She did not want staff, advisors, or titles protecting either woman from the truth. The inventory file remained between them. Camilla's hands tightened as she asked who had given Anne the authority to decide whether she belonged. She accused her of using a dead woman's memory to punish a living one. Anne did not raise her voice. The Princess Royal slid the file across the table and said, "Access to an heirloom could never erase the emotional meaning attached to it. An heirloom was a family object passed through generations, carrying memories as well as value." Camilla heard the explanation, but the quietness of it hurt more than anger. She felt judged, excluded, and reduced to someone still seeking permission. Then Camilla revealed what Anne had not expected. During a private conversation months earlier, Charles had told his wife he saw no problem with her wearing the ruby tiara. The queen consort repeated his words carefully. Anne's expression changed. Her brother may have offered reassurance without ever reading the family restriction. Anne opened the file. She pointed to the handwritten phrase, "Direct family discretion." The Princess Royal explained that the wording allowed close family judgment over access, rather than automatic use by rank. She had already invoked that discretion. Camilla read the line once, then again. The decision was no longer only Anne's anger. It had become a recorded rule. Camilla stood and said Charles would reverse the restriction. The queen consort left convinced the king would reopen the door, while Anne remained behind, knowing her brother was about to face a harder truth. Camilla walked away believing the king would reopen the door, but Charles was about to learn that Anne had locked it, using rules his own family had preserved for decades. King Charles expected a family dispute. What reached his desk was something far more difficult. The restriction was not a handwritten note from an angry sister or a sudden command issued in emotion. Anne had used a narrow family authority tied directly to the custody of inherited personal jewels. Charles read the framework once, then again. By the third reading, the monarch understood why Camilla had been so certain he could save her, and why he might not be able to do it without tearing open an even larger wound. Charles removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Crown jewels were ceremonial pieces connected to the monarchy itself, while personally inherited family jewels belonged to a separate private tradition. The ruby tiara sat under a custody arrangement, meaning access could be controlled by close family judgment when old instructions were unclear. That distinction mattered because Anne had not challenged the crown. She had acted inside the family's private authority. Anne held influence because she had long been trusted to review certain inherited objects. The Princess Royal could examine old instructions and recommend temporary access limits when ownership or intended use carried emotional uncertainty. Charles felt angry that his sister had moved first. Yet the king also felt shame. He remembered telling Camilla, almost casually, that he saw no problem with her wearing the tiara. William entered for a private conversation and immediately sensed his father's frustration. The prince chose his words carefully. He told Charles that reversing Anne simply to protect Camilla from embarrassment would turn family history into a marital favor. The future king did not attack the queen consort. He only warned that one emotional promise could create a larger problem. Charles looked again at the custody framework. Anne had not claimed the tiara for herself. She had transferred it into restricted family custody, which meant no current senior royal could treat the jewel as personal property. The Princess Royal had closed the door on exclusive possession, including her own. That changed the argument. Then Charles reached the condition he had feared. To overturn the restriction, the king would have to sign a written reason explaining why Camilla's exclusive ceremonial access served the inherited wishes attached to the tiara. He read the wording twice. The monarch could defend his wife. He could defend her dignity. But he could not honestly claim that her private request fulfilled the intentions of people long dead. Charles refused to reverse Anne immediately. When Camilla learned through the formal custody notice that her husband had not acted, her humiliation turned cold. The queen consort no longer saw delay. She saw silence. For Camilla, the most painful sound was not Anne saying no. It was the silence from the husband she had expected to say yes. Camilla did not explode when the answer arrived. She did something far more unsettling. She dismissed the aide, closed the sitting room door, and remained completely alone. On the small table beside her rested a briefing for the Commonwealth reception, where she had imagined wearing the ruby tiara. She picked it up, read 3 lines, and placed it face down. In that quiet movement, the new reality became brutally clear. Charles had not overturned Anne. The restriction was standing. Camilla read the decision again. The Queen Mother's ruby tiara would remain under restricted family custody, meaning the jewel could not be used freely by one royal without wider family approval. Her request had also been removed from the ceremonial planning for the Commonwealth reception. That mattered, because she had expected the tiara to help define her role during a major public occasion. Royal staff quietly changed the jewelry arrangements. A different piece was selected, and the revised briefing moved forward without debate. Camilla understood what no one needed to say. Every person handling the change knew why the ruby tiara had disappeared from the plan, and the queen consort felt embarrassment burn beneath her anger. Camilla remained alone for several minutes. She had survived criticism before, but this felt different. The rejection touched an older fear that some members of the family still saw her as permanently outside their shared memory. She had gained rank, duty, and public responsibility. Yet one closed jewel case seemed to tell her that acceptance could still be withheld. Charles entered later and tried to explain. The king said he could not sign a reason strong enough to overturn Anne's restriction. Camilla listened, then asked the question he dreaded. "Do you agree with her?" The monarch paused. That silence hurt more than the words that followed, because she already understood what it meant. Camilla finally explained herself during that private conversation. She said the exclusive use request had never been about ownership. The queen consort wanted a recognizable ceremonial image linked to her role, something the public would immediately connect with her. Charles suddenly understood. His wife had been asking for recognition, while Anne had heard a claim over family memory. Then Charles told her about one possible path. Anne had said the tiara might eventually return to wider family use, but never as the exclusive symbol of one living royal. Camilla lowered her eyes. The king's explanation confirmed that the restriction was not temporary confusion. It directly rejected the heart of her request. The conflict seemed frozen, until Anne unexpectedly asked Charles for a private meeting. No staff, no documents, no discussion of authority, only brother and sister. And when Anne finally removed the paperwork from between them, Charles heard the reason she had been unable to say in any official room. Princess Anne met her brother without an aide outside the door, and without the ruby tiara anywhere near them. For the first time since the dispute began, there was no inventory, no restriction notice, and no royal machinery to absorb the emotion. Charles sat opposite her and asked one simple question: why this piece? Anne did not answer immediately. Then the Princess Royal spoke about their grandmother, memory, and the fear that the family had begun using inherited symbols to settle present-day insecurities. Anne knew the formal arguments had reached their limit. This was no longer a meeting between senior royals carrying public duties. It was a conversation between a brother and sister who had inherited the same family memories but understood them differently. The Queen Mother had treated jewelry as shared memory, she explained, not personal branding. To her, that belief gave the tiara meaning far beyond rank. Anne admitted she did not hate Camilla. The Princess Royal said she had no wish to humiliate her, and the words came through a private conversation Charles would later remember in detail. She knew the restriction would feel like rejection. Yet doing nothing, she said, would have felt like betraying the standards she had watched their grandmother protect. Charles lowered his voice. The king confessed that he had informally reassured Camilla about the tiara because he wanted his wife to feel secure. He had seen her uncertainty and tried to calm it with a promise that seemed harmless at the time. Now the monarch understood that he may have confused protecting her with offering something that was not his alone to give. Anne finally revealed her intention. The Princess Royal did not want the ruby tiara placed under her personal control. She wanted it preserved for shared family use in the next generation, with clear rules stopping any one living royal from claiming it as an exclusive emblem. That mattered because the jewel could then remain part of family memory instead of becoming a symbol of present-day rivalry. Charles sat silently before answering. The king accepted the restriction. He also agreed that he would explain the decision to Camilla himself. He would not blame Anne, hide behind procedure, or pretend that unnamed palace officials had created the refusal. The monarch had made a promise once. Now he would face the pain of correcting it. The siblings left that conversation with painful clarity. But beyond those private walls, the dispute had already escaped. One public image was about to turn the ruby tiara into a national argument. Inside the family, the decision had finally found its meaning. Outside the palace, it was about to acquire a completely different one. By morning, the dispute no longer belonged to the royal family. It belonged to television panels, newspaper editors, royal watchers, and crowds pressed against barriers outside Windsor. The ruby tiara had become a symbol before anyone publicly confirmed a single internal conversation. Some saw Anne as the last uncompromising guardian of old royal memory. Others saw Camilla being deliberately excluded. Then one newspaper front page appeared, and a private family wound was transformed into a national image nobody could ignore. The argument spread quickly. Commentators defended family discretion, meaning the right of close relatives to control inherited personal objects, while others asked why Camilla still seemed vulnerable to symbolic rejection. Palace staff released a restrained statement describing the tiara as a privately managed family heirloom. That meant it belonged to family history rather than routine ceremonial use. The careful wording only deepened the controversy because it confirmed the jewel was not being prepared for her. Anne watched the morning coverage in silence. The Princess Royal did not react until one broadcaster called her decision a punishment in rubies. She switched off the television and told an aide she would not fight a family matter through headlines. Her anger was controlled, but the accusation hurt, because she believed she had protected shared memory, not attacked Camilla. Camilla heard a different wound being discussed. The Queen Consort watched another panel question whether she would ever be fully accepted within the old Windsor memory. She turned away from the screen. The words exposed the insecurity she had tried to hide, and suddenly her private fear was being debated by strangers. Then the front page appeared. A large image of the ruby tiara dominated the page beneath the headline, "Anne locks the vault." A smaller photograph showed Camilla arriving alone at a royal engagement. The Queen Consort saw it. Anne saw it. The image reduced a painful family dispute to one brutal message. One woman had closed the door, and another had been left outside. Outside Windsor Castle, a small crowd gathered. One woman held a handwritten sign reading, "History is not a costume," while another argued that dignity should never depend on inherited jewels. Cameras captured both in the same frame, and the contrast spread across broadcasts within hours. Charles finally understood the danger. The king saw that silence was causing more damage than the restriction itself. He decided the family needed one clear internal verdict, one answer that left no doubt about the tiara or Camilla's place. The world had turned a ruby tiara into a verdict on belonging, so the royal family now had only one choice left: to decide what the jewel truly meant and live with that answer. The final decision was not delivered at a banquet, through a dramatic proclamation, or beneath the weight of another public headline. It came quietly. Charles met Anne and Camilla in a private room and placed the final family arrangement before them. The Queen Mother's ruby tiara would remain restricted from exclusive personal use. Camilla would not receive the access she had requested. Anne would not claim the jewel for herself. And for the first time, all three were forced to confront what the conflict had really exposed. Charles placed the arrangement between them. The ruby tiara would remain in restricted shared family custody, meaning no royal could claim exclusive use. Future ceremonial use required collective family approval. The jewel would remain tied to shared memory. Camilla read the page and set it down. The Queen Consort admitted the decision still hurt. She told Anne that being denied access felt like being told she would never belong. Her voice stayed controlled, but the wound was open. Anne answered without triumph. The Princess Royal said belonging could not be proved by wearing another woman's memories. She admitted her manner had been severe, but refused to apologize for preventing the tiara from becoming an exclusive symbol. Charles lowered his eyes and accepted his part. The king admitted he had encouraged Camilla's expectation because he wanted his wife to feel secure. He made clear that Anne had acted to preserve the heirloom's shared status, not to strip Camilla of her royal position. Then the monarch named the failure. All three had allowed a jewel to carry words they were unwilling to say directly. Camilla wanted acceptance. Anne wanted restraint. Charles wanted peace without confrontation. Now the truth stood between them. Camilla withdrew her request. The queen consort accepted the restriction. Anne confirmed the ruby tiara would remain preserved for family use, and the princess royal made no personal claim. Charles closed the file. This time, the gesture meant conclusion. The battle had never been about rubies. It was about memory, belonging, and using inherited symbols to heal present pain. Anne did not win a jewel. Camilla did not lose her place. Charles did not rescue everyone from suffering. They accepted a harder truth. Royal history could be respected without being possessed, and belonging could not be manufactured through a tiara. The jewel remained under shared protection, the request was closed, and the family moved forward knowing. And with the ruby tiara returned to silence, the argument finally ended, not because anyone forgot the pain, but because all three understood the boundary that would never again be crossed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.